you folks showed up today to share this webinar with me. I am Al Paul, one of the support analysts. I probably have worked with most of you since 2010, and I'm really happy to be here today to share a webinar that was suggested to me by somebody else that you've definitely worked with over the years, and that's Catherine Jocour, who's our triage person. Every ticket that you've submitted the past few years has crossed Catherine's desk, which puts her in a unique position to know what you've been asking about. Catherine suggested this topic because we do get a fair number of questions about performance updates. Interestingly, my slides are not moving across here from where I'm showing them in my world to where they should be in your world. You got the one slide, but I should be better. I should be on my second slide by now. Yeah, you're still seeing the original slide. Why is that? Let's start this over. We're going to do a PowerPoint reboot and bring my slides back up. I apologize. It's highly unusual. Beautiful. You know, interestingly enough, Catherine was one of the first people to sign up to attend today's webinar, so I probably shouldn't screw this up. A little housekeeping before we start. We're going to run on mute today because the audio works better. Questions will be handled after the session, not during. If you have a question, email it to me directly. You see my email address there on the screen. We are recording this session today. Thankfully, I still do not have a webcam, but the presentation itself, including audio, will be posted on the internet. We actually store these on the SRB SIS YouTube channel, which you can link to from our community pages. And you know the address by now, community.schoollogic.com. So you see that address up here as well. You'll notice that address is bigger than my address. This one's probably more important. By the way, I expect to have you out of here in about 50 minutes today, 50. For our purposes today, we will be using, we'll at least begin using at the top, we'll be using SchoolLogic 4.2.5, and we will update it to 4.3 right in front of you guys today, which will be released. 4.3 will be released within the next week, which is to say that I downloaded 4.3 before it was official. I could show you on our servers where to find those things before they go public, but then I'd have to, you know, kill you. And so it's healthier for you to wait until we release them officially. Now, along those same lines of skullduggery, you should be pleased to learn that while I was researching the release notes for 4.3 last week, I observed that development already has a bunch of tickets in their hopper for SchoolLogic 4.4. That should be in your hands before the school year ends. And it looks to me like your operators will, across the board, finally be able to save labels for individual students when running reports, like, as an example, fee reports. And I think we will finally get rid of that blank date, you know, January 1, 1900. In our software, that's essentially blank. That prints right now, it prints below the student's birth date on the academic transcript. So look for those couple things in SchoolLogic 4.4 and a lot more. I expect that'll be out before the school year ends. I expect 4.3 will probably be within your hands within the next week. Now, let's talk about updates. From 10,000 feet, updating is really a pretty simple process. You back up your software, you back up your data, you shut down IIS, you run the updates, and you restart IIS. And if everything works, it's, you know, really not that difficult. But as always, when the closer we get to ground zero, the more steps pop up. I'm here to tell you, it's still not that complicated. We're going to gather some materials, right? Then we're going to back up our stuff. Then we shut down IIS, and then there's three things. Update the data, update the reports, update the SchoolLogic software in our virtual directory. We'll show you that. Optionally, sometimes we update HomeLogic, sometimes we update TeacherLogic, and always at the end we restart IIS. Enough with the PowerPoint slides. It's much more fun to show you the real stuff. So when I talk about gathering materials, what am I really talking about? I'm talking about these three components right here. The database updater, the reports updater, and the actual software updater. If you're going to update HomeLogic, government reporting, or TeacherLogic, each of those has its own updater. And here's a little tidbit. This got a lot of tidbits for you today. Got a lot of tips. Got a lot of stuff that I think will help you out. First tidbit that and you'll hear me repeat this again later. Anytime you're updating multiple pieces of our suite of products, if TeacherLogic is one of the things you're updating, update TeacherLogic last. If you're going to do a group, do TeacherLogic last, because that order ensures the DLL files which TeacherLogic installs get installed correctly and don't get run over by something else, like the next thing you install. And if you do that right, then Logic Admin works correctly. So, okay, now we've gathered our materials. Where did we get them? Okay, you should have received an email from us. Within the next week, you'll receive something from us with SchoolLogic 4.3. The updates will either be in an attachment to that email, or the email will have a link to the updated materials. Since sending attachments often gets bounced by school security stuff, or we'll send you a Hightail file. Hightail is our third-party file mover. Or you grab the download off of our community page, community.schoollogic.com. And then from there, well, it's your business. And I've never, ever met a tech director who didn't have a whole file of updaters backed up on a server drive somewhere. Now, after we've gathered our materials, it's a good idea to create backups. And we're going to back up two separate pieces, your SchoolLogic software and your actual data. Now, step number one, let's worry about the SchoolLogic software. I guarantee you that your SchoolLogic software is in a directory called www.root, 3wroot. It's inside of a directory called inetpub, and I would expect to find those two directories on the C drive of your web server. Those of you who use more than one server to run our suite of products will have a data server and at least one web server on which the actual SchoolLogic software lives. Those of you who have a single server to do everything, that is data and serve software on the same server, well, you folks, finding in www.root directory is even easier. Now here on my hard drive, this is my actual computer, okay, I have a ton of SchoolLogic software directories. By the way, the other term that you'll hear us use is we will call this a virtual directory. So each of these is a SchoolLogic virtual directory. Now on your servers, I would not expect to see like 20 of these things, okay? You're probably going to have 3. Your servers will probably look like this. Excuse me. The SchoolLogic virtual directory, this is the main one. SchoolLogic government reporting, he gets his own virtual directory. And then on many schools, I will find a sandbox. Okay, now, here's another little tip. If you're unfamiliar with Sandbox, which you see here at the top of this directory, have you ever wanted to kind of like make a change in your data just to see what would happen? Maybe you want to change how something is displayed or configured, but you didn't want to do it because it's live data. Maybe you want to test one of our updates before you deploy it to your live data. Well, you're not alone. A lot of other schools have wanted to do that as well. And many schools do have a separate database which they use for testing. Sandbox, that's the most common name. And that can be the name of the database and also the name of the virtual directory, which is what I recommend. I would say name your actual data and your virtual directory the same because it reduces the potential for confusion. Really works out pretty well. You end up with one virtual directory for each database. The databases are totally separate, so are the virtual directories. Works out slick. 90% of your operators never will realize there are 2 databases and 2 of these guys. You only give the URL tied to the sandbox to those people you truly want in there. The only thing that gets a little tricky is in the sandbox is when you start to do the more involved reports, like report cards and transcripts, but that's a story for another day. The only point I want to make to you about having a sandbox is this. There's this old adage, the more stuff you got, the more stuff you got to take care of. Now, if you're not familiar with that adage, ask any of your friends who have snowmobiles, motorcycles, snowblowers, and chainsaws, especially if they have multiples. The more stuff you got, the more stuff you got to take care of. The same is true here. When we start discussing updating your software, your data, and maybe your reports folder, consider how many of each of them you have and whether you want them all running the same version. Some schools choose to have their sandbox be either a version behind or a version ahead. It's your choice. But I digress. We came into the www.root folder because we wanted to make a backup of our SchoolLogic data, right? Here we're on www.root, and here's SchoolLogic. And all I'm going to suggest is that you say copy, and you go ahead and say paste, okay? Just a simple backup, nothing real extravagant. Takes you just a couple minutes. We want to make sure, I have not seen our updaters make something fooey in your virtual directory, but there's a really important file in your virtual directory, which we'll show you a little bit later, web.config. And so my advice is, it takes a minute, literally, to come in here and make a quick, what I call a quick and dirty copy, quick and dirty backup, and it just puts you in a better position for success down the road, just in case something goofy does happen. Now, to actually back up the actual data, of course, we're going to go into SQL Management Studio. Came up on my other monitor. Here it is. Okay. Now, in SQL Management Studio, most of you, I'm sure, know the ropes here. I'm going to pick, by the way, today we're going to work with a database called Various. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say Tasks. I'm going to say Backup. And then I'm going to remove whatever's already there. And I'm going to say, no, I want to add a new backup path. All I'm doing here is I'm picking where is this database going to live? Where is backup going to go? And I have a nice folder right here called SQL Databases to load from. Then I got to go ahead and name it. And when you name it, you got to always include the .bak, because for reasons not entirely clear to me, Microsoft didn't write this, that gets included automatically. So you tell the computer where you want to put it, and you tell it needs to be a BAK, and you keep clicking OK. When you get it back in this window, you're good to go. Now, like I said, most of you guys have done this before, but not every school makes their backups the same way. And I just wanted to point out this second step. When you're making a backup for updating, all we're really trying to do here is to create a fail-safe data version for you to fall back on in the extremely unlikely scenario that something goes awry in the update process. Now, seriously, that's not some kind of stock phrase from Al. I've been doing this since 2010. I do not recall an updater ever munching my data. But whether you're making a backup database for the update process or you're making a copy to send to us in support, I suggest engaging this second button, Overwrite all existing backup sets. Engaging this means that you're producing one copy of your DB. It's going to be a standalone copy. If you pick append, which is the default choice, you're adding this backup to previous backups, and size becomes an issue, and it's backup added to backup added to backup, and then it's tough to know, particularly when we get it, which copy is which and which copy do we truly want to deal with. Overwrite all existing backup sets does not mean you're going to wipe out all the other ones you have stored in that directory. Believe me, I do this every day. That's not what happens. Then down here, under reliability, I always check verify backup when finished. Now, I'm not a SQL engineer. I'm not going to tell you what that actually does because I don't know what that actually does. But engaging it is simple. It doesn't take much time, and it just checks things out before everything is done. Like I said, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but look, it doesn't cost you money. It takes very little time. Why would I not want to verify my backup? I'm already 70% done. Then, of course, you click OK, as you saw me do at the bottom, and we're off to the races. So this guy is going to complete very, very quickly. So I'm 90% done. Now it's actually verifying, and that'll be done very, very quickly, and we will be able to check off step number 1 from our list, because we will have backed up our SchoolLogic software, and we will have backed up our SchoolLogic data. Look at that. The backup was created successfully. So that was my data backup. My software backup, there you see it right here, SchoolLogic copy. Okay, so now I have completed the safety steps. Now, here's a little tip before we go on to the next part of our process, which is to shut down IIS. If you go back to your actual SchoolLogic and go back up here to the login, okay, you probably never noticed this because you do this every day, but the SchoolLogic version number and the database version number are down here on the bottom. Write those down. When you're doing an update, write down those numbers. We've got SchoolLogic 4.2.5, and we've got database 2.2.369. Write them down, because we're going to use those numbers to verify that the updaters really are doing their thing correctly. And hey, here's another little tip. Did you guys know this? If you go into SQL and you tell it select star from SchoolLogic version, SchoolLogic all one word, you can get SQL to tell you. Now what I'm doing here is I'm scrolling to the bottom. Look, 4.2.5, 2.2.369. Okay, I didn't know if you knew you could do that in SQL. Various is my database, right, that we're working with. You can do that with SchoolLogic version. You can do that with DB version. That'll just tell you this number by itself. You can do that with SIRS version. Cool, eh? Merry Christmas. For now, right now, we're going to remember 425, 2.2.369. Now, the next step before we go any further is to down IIS. Of course, I've got that preloaded, because I don't want to slow the process down here in the webinar. Launch IIS, click Stop. Now, I probably don't really need to tell you that turning off IIS, Internet Information Services, means 3 things. Nobody can do any business in TeacherLogic. Nobody can do any business in SchoolLogic. Nobody can do any business in HomeLogic. And yes, you can't run government reports either. Now, that's fine going forward from this moment in time. But it also means that if you were in one of those parts of our suite, the change you were making when I shut down IIS will be lost. So you guys know the drill. Always warn your operators in advance before you shut down IIS. How far in advance? Well, that's your business. But my advice is warn them early, warn them often, and warn them that you warned them. For the record, and this probably won't surprise you, but when I was a younger person, I may have been one of those kids who often replied to a command or a suggestion from someone in authority with, why? Why are we shutting down IIS? Well, on the web server, we stop the IIS service so that operators can't access the data and interrupt or corrupt our update process. Even if nobody else is in your building, some of my teammates in tech support suggest shutting down IIS because the mere fact that it's running can somehow alter how SQL reacts. And so now we begin the nitty and the gritty of actually running the updates. We shut down IIS. Now we go and we're going to update the actual data. So you remember I gathered my 3 little pieces here that I need. I'm going to click the database installer. Now, the database installer comes up and it's asking us, hey, where's the data you want me to update? My experience is that if you try to pick a server from this drop-down list, it takes a really long time. So I'm going to just go in here and I'm going to type in the name of my server. Now it happens that on my server I have 3 different versions of SQL. So I'm going to tell the computer which version, which instance of SQL matters. And I could just as well have said PC. That's the name of my machine, but I'm going to say local. Okay? And then when I click here, boom, there's my list of databases. Okay? So this is a quick and easy way to verify that this is correct. You made the right choice here if you see the databases that you want here. Now, on the bottom part of the window, it's saying, how am I going to connect? Am I going to connect using Windows authentication? Am I going to connect using the actual SQL Server address, ID password? Most people, most of the time, just pick Windows authentication. For whatever reason, this is kind of how I roll. I actually do the password from SQL. Teach your own. I'm going to click Next, and now this is an interesting place to stop, because here the installer is giving me a little checkup. The installer is saying, here, the database version is 2.2.369. Now, if that number does not agree with the number that you wrote down when we started back at that login screen, then you got a problem. And the problem most likely is this guy here is pointed at the wrong database. And you can always go back and you can change it. Okay, so that's what we'll check. And then you see my perform backup before updating. Okay, well, we don't have to do that because you remember you watched me back up the data already out in SQL. Now, most people don't, it's a horse apiece. Do you want to do the backup first or do you want to come and do it now? Doesn't matter. You can do it either place. If you're like me, you did it up front. Okay? Then I just go ahead and I say update. Not that hard. Doesn't take that long. Okay? Did you ever get the message that the update may not have performed correctly? Yeah, I get that message sometimes too. In fact, I got it when I was practicing for this webinar. And I have yet to see the update process actually not complete correctly, assuming that your infrastructure is all operating correctly. So I think Microsoft just maybe doesn't trust SchoolLogic or something. We're not the biggest player in the world, right? We're obviously not as huge as, let's say, our good friends at Norton or our friends at any of the bigger companies like Oracle. So maybe, I don't know, if Microsoft doesn't trust us or whatever, but you get that message and say, did this really complete correctly? And like I said, I've always seen it work. So step number 2, if step number 1 was we did our backup, step number 2, we've now updated our data. That leads us to reports. And you launch your reports installer. The next thing we're going to update is our SchoolLogic reports. Even if you have more than one SchoolLogic database, you probably only have one of these. Now, of course, I got 16 of everything, but let's go back to that location I just did where we had the updaters, we launched it. Now, in this top pick list, the question is, into what instance of SQL did you install your reports? I have 3 instances of SQL on my machine. I happen to know that the only reporting services I use is 2008 R2. Excuse me. Most schools, most of the time, they're only going to have one choice here. If you have a question about whether you made the correct choice here, the question is going to be answered down here. Now, this is one part of this process that usually takes way longer than you just saw. What we're doing here is the software, the installer has gone into this instance of reporting services, and it's saying, show me all the SchoolLogic report folders. And as you can see, I have about 9 of them here, and I'm going to pick the one that I want to work with. Okay? This command right here, View Selected Report Server, it just launched another screen on my other monitor. Let me bring it across for you. This is my reports. In my SQL reporting services, I have all of these report folders. You saw them listed vertically here. Here, way easier to see them because it's a picture. Now, if you look at the URL here, most people, most of the time, if you want to go to your report manager, and you occasionally do have to go out into here, when you're changing where it's pointing, the name of your SQL server, the web server, or I misspoke, most of the time the report manager stuff is actually on your data server. So you've got the name of your server and then just reports, typically reports, pages, folder.aspx gets you to this. I have to have this other business in here because I've got multiple versions of SQL. So that's all of my reporting folders, and what I've done is I've said to the computer, hey, I want to update this guy. We click Next. Now, this screen can get just a little tricky. Most people, most of the time, should accept the defaults on this second page. The top part of this box addresses whether you want the reports folder to point at a different database than it does now. Most people, most of the time, are going to say, no. My reports folder already points in the right place. I just need it to be updated. Okay? On the other hand, if you wanted to change it, you engage this button, and I'm going to say I want my report folder, right, 4.3, I want him to point at various. And then you go through the same thing we had on the other window with how am I going to log into the reporting system to tell it to do this. And I prefer the standard SQL password that is part of my install. Credentials ASP process, probably the answer most people use most of the time. Okay? To review, what we're addressing here is in everyone's reports folder, there's a SchoolLogic file. Inside of that file is stored the information that we're editing in the top of this box. The question before us is, for this reports folder, which reports folder? The report folder we picked here. For that report folder, where do we want, which database do we want it to point at? That's all this is about. Most schools, most of the time, only wish to update their reports, not to change where the database they report on. Therefore, most people, most of the time, accept the default here, and they click Next. Okay? Now, this truly does take about 5 minutes. So I'm not going to actually do this live during the webinar, but I wanted to show you this window because I wanted to point out to you that in the top portion of the activity window, you will be getting some verification information as we move along here. So when you start this process of updating the reports, it'll tell you up front which reporting folder I'm working on, and then eventually it will show you a long, long list of the reports that it's putting in there. Which brings us to the third and final element of most SchoolLogic updates. And that's, we're going to update the actual SchoolLogic software in that virtual directory, and we'll show you that. Interestingly enough, in 4.3, I downloaded this off of our server like 15 days ago. I'm getting an evaluation version of the installer. Marvelous. By the way, it's worked for me in practice. I have no doubt it'll work today. So here I am. I'm going to click Next. And this is pretty much the only opportunity I get to exercise a choice in the software updater. The question the installer is asking me is, in which virtual directory am I going to update the items? Now, you remember our glimpse of the various directories, right? Virtual directories are where the SchoolLogic software actually lives. Most people, most of the time, these are your choices. And when you're confronted with this window here, you're going to say SchoolLogic because that's the default name of what most people run for their production software. I am going to choose various because that's the one that we're going to deal with today. On my machine, when I run a software update, I have to pick from this list. There's like 36 different virtual directories in here. Do not attempt that at home. So I'm going to just come in here and I'm going to type various. No pick lists. You just type what you want. At most schools, most of the time, SchoolLogic's your choice. On the other hand, if you did want to update that sandbox, okay, this is where you would point it, the updater, at the sandbox. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And while it's actually updating my software, I'll tell you another little tip. My other little tip is don't be lazy. If you want to update both your SchoolLogic virtual directory, the one that you use for production database everybody hits every day, and your sandbox. Okay, now it's stopping me and it's saying, you know what, I just want to verify, Al, this is really the database, the virtual directory you want to update. It's called Various, it's inside of www.root, it's inside inetpub. You bet. That's absolutely the one I want to install, and I'm going to go ahead and now actually do the work. Back to my tip. Let's say you've got Sandbox and you've got SchoolLogic. It is not good enough to run the updater on your SchoolLogic folder, then open it, copy all the contents into the Sandbox virtual directory. Okay? Well, so how does the updater work? I mean, I came in there and I filled in the virtual directory, right? Well, what would I do the next time? The idea is really simple. You're going to run the installer once, pointed at SchoolLogic. Then you're going to run it a second time, pointed at Sandbox. And that's going to update the actual SchoolLogic software in there each time. Now, why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because inside of your SchoolLogic virtual directory, let's go with that one. I don't actually use mine. Okay? Inside of each SchoolLogic virtual directory is a web config file. Inside of that web config file, we're specifically telling the software, I want you to go to this server, I want you to go to this instance of SQL, and find this database. Okay? Remember, I happen to be in a virtual directory here called Area 51. That's the database I want you to go hit. Because remember what I told you earlier, it's a really, really good idea if you're going to have multiple virtual directories, multiple versions of SchoolLogic, it makes a ton of sense to me personally to name the databases exactly the same thing. And that's what I do on my machine. Okay? This file is inside of each virtual directory. So if I just go in here and I say, okay, I update Area 51, and then I copy all the files into Gophers, all of a sudden Gophers is pointing at Area 51. Not a great answer. Okay? So the way that the software knows where to go is that web config file. You don't just want to update your web config file and then shoot it into another virtual directory. If you have multiple virtual directories, run the updater against each of them individually. And like pretty much every other installer you've ever worked with, when you get to this piece at the end, you click Finish. And then the next thing you should do, because right, we updated the database, we updated the reports installer, we updated the actual software. Okay? We need to go back here to IIS, and we need to turn things on. Okay, and now comes the moment of truth. You go back here to your SchoolLogic login. This is where we used to be, and I'm going to refresh the page, and this better say 4.3 point something. And that'll take a while to sort out. But I'm expecting that the software version on the left and the database version on the right are going to be higher than when we started. So I like to think that if you proceed at a reasonable speed, reasonable being defined as something less than 1,230 kilometers per hour at 21 degrees centigrade at sea level, you read the screens, you know where everything is stored in your world, and by everything I mean your data and your actual SchoolLogic software. This process is not terribly difficult, okay? And by the way, it worked because I was at 4.2.5, now I'm at 4.3.22, and my data was like 369, and now my data is 386. Okay, so I just said this process is not that difficult. I will agree with you that back in January, it was a little more difficult, but only the one time. Back in January, we released SchoolLogic 4.1.6, which was our first version higher than 4.0. When we went to SchoolLogic 4, we changed a ton of stuff behind the scenes, not the least of which was changing the .NET framework we use. We went from using .NET Framework 2 to .NET Framework 4, which means you schools had to modify your application pools in IIS. You also had to edit major portions of your actual web config file in your virtual directories. That's that file I showed you a minute ago, where its most important job is telling the SchoolLogic software how to locate the database. That was a one-time thing in January. If you are running 4.1.6 or 4.2.5 today, if you're running 4 dot anything, running updates to 4.3 or 4.4 will be as smooth as I showed you in the last 27 minutes. But if you're still running 3 dot something, like 3.1.283, I must first of all tell you there are more steps than I showed you today. There's all those steps that I referred to that the other schools ran in January. And secondly, if you're running 3.1.283, I must ask you why you haven't updated since January. That's a question for another day. But before we part ways today, there are just 2 more things I want to quickly look at. I want to look at SchoolLogic government reporting, and I want to look at TeacherLogic. So let's go to SchoolLogic government reporting. Did you see what I just did there? Most people, most of the time, they're in SchoolLogic and they go to student and they go to government reporting and they pick launch government reporting, right? That's not what I just did. What I just did was I clicked on a shortcut. You know, I had this guy stored. All I did was I took the URL, right? Because in setup, under preferences and under file paths, oh, it's not liking me because I've been away too long. In setup, under preferences, under file paths, you have all entered the path to SchoolLogic Help, the path to TeacherLogic, and the path to HomeLogic, and the path to government reporting. So all you have to do is take that path that you've entered in there, paste it into a browser, and then train it to be a shortcut. Okay? Way simpler. Like it. Now, notice in the main window here that government reporting has its own version number. We're in, 4.2.5 or 4.3 SchoolLogic. This guy is 4.4.5 or 4.4.6. 4.4.6, and if you don't have your nose pressed up against the monitor. Okay? Now, government reporting almost always will have a different version number than you see in SchoolLogic. But on the right, the database version that you see in SchoolLogic should be the same as the database version you see in government reporting, because 99.999% of the time, you've got government reporting pointed at the same database SchoolLogic is pointed at. You can actually point government reporting somewhere else, which is actually what's going on my machine right now, but I don't know why you'd want to do that. Because there is a web config file for government reporting. Just like in SchoolLogic, that web config file determines which database the software is accessing. Now, before we get to updating government reporting, I want to show you a little bit more about how the land kind of lays. Government reporting, like SchoolLogic and like TeacherLogic and like HomeLogic, gets installed in that www.root folder, right? Here's www.root. And here's SchoolLogic government reporting. And here's the web config file. Remember, he's the guy that points the government reporting at the data. Now, the top portion of this file is very similar to the top section of a SchoolLogic web config file. Notably, up here, we tell the government reporting software which reports folder to use. We tell you, you're going to need an ID, and you're going to need a password to get into that reporting folder. And then these final 2 lines of the top section are identical to a SchoolLogic web config file, if SchoolLogic is version 4. Okay. Now, see how in the top line I've got 2005 and 2005, and in the bottom line I've got 2010, 2010. Okay. That's exactly how that portion of a web config file is supposed to look in either government reporting or SchoolLogic. Having either 2005 in all 4 locations or 2010 in all 4 locations is not an infrequent condition. We see that quite often in tech support. Having either of those 2 conditions produces some really ugly but consistent error messages, which are actually easy to fix. You just come in here and you make it 2005 on the top line, 2010 on the bottom line. You have to make those 2 lines look like this. 2005, both locations on the top, 2010, both locations on the bottom. This is true in SchoolLogic government reporting, and it's true in SchoolLogic itself if you're running version 4. And then down here, just like in SchoolLogic, there's this whole line of where's my database, which database do I want. Remember, I told you that you could actually point these separately. In SchoolLogic, I'm currently pointed at various, and this guy is currently pointed at skunkworks. Okay? If you don't remember skunkworks, you can Google that after you get out of the meeting with me and find out what skunkwork was in World War II. And then I've got my ID and my password. Okay? Just like this exact same file that controls SchoolLogic. And yes, you'll notice it's set up exactly the same way. Now, here's another little tip. Let me show you a little something here from my PowerPoint world. Server error in SchoolLogic government reporting application. Validation of view state MAC failed. If this application is hosted by a web farm or cluster, ensure that machine key configuration specifies the same validation key and validation algorithm. Auto-generate cannot be used in a cluster. Yeah, of course not. Auto-generate can't be used in a cluster. And is this a cluster? I'll tell you that. Seriously, there are probably audience members out there who actually understand the specifics of this error message better than I do. But I've seen this error message more than once, and all I know is what my teammates have shown me about this error. And fixing this error, you'll be pleased, is really relatively simple. If you come into your web config file, and I'm going to just go Control F at my keyboard. I just wanted to get up a fine window, and I'm going to search for pages. I'm going to do it twice, because I need the second instance of the word pages in this file. The second instance of the word pages here is right above this line that talks about compilation debug. Sometimes this says true. If it says true, you got to change it to false, and then that other error goes away. So it's not very difficult. You just got to know what to do about it. It's not huge. It's not involved. It's not that difficult. You got to take care of true versus false. Now, the second part of my little tip about this error message is that this is a good time to check the application pool which your government reporting is using, because that's important. Clear all my back screens here. We'll go back to IIS. I'm sorry. That's SQL. Let me find IIS. Now, if we are in IIS, and we go down the left side here, we open our sites, we open our default website, and we find SchoolLogic government reporting. Okay? Every one of these is a virtual directory of mine that has something to do with either SchoolLogic or TeacherLogic or HomeLogic. HomeLogic's right there. Here's SchoolLogic government reporting. Now, once you click on that, we're going to go over to the far right. We're going to click on basic settings. And right away, it shows us that the application pool for SchoolLogic government reporting is version 4. That's really all we were trying to find out. And yes, in most schools, most of the time, the pools really are named this blatantly. But if you have any uncertainty, you can always do this. You can always go back to the top on the left. Okay, well, all we were trying to do there was we wanted to verify that SchoolLogic government reporting was using an app pool that was version 4. We care about the same thing with respect to SchoolLogic. Is SchoolLogic, Various is the guy I'm using, right? If I click on that, is Various using, I actually went out to the, clicked in the wrong place here, is Various using an app pool that uses version 4? The answer is yes. Now, this by itself doesn't really tell me that, but check this out. If I go back to my application pools, it gives me a list of all of them. And SchoolLogic, Various, he was using SchoolLogic 4. That is, in fact, a .NET Framework 4. Just like ASP.NET, that's what SchoolLogic Government Reporting is using. He's also version 4. Okay? So it's not that hard to remember. If I'm using version 4 in the SchoolLogic side, I got to use version 4 of the .NET Framework. Now, as for actually updating government reporting, the materials which we gathered earlier, right? When we ship government reporting, you're going to get an updater just like we got for the other products. Another thing, the thing to be really cognizant of, because government reporting cares, is government reporting is very dependent on the database version number of SchoolLogic. It's very, very common that when we give you a government reporting update, we also require a database update. That's because we frequently have to update fields and tables in the database in order for many of the government reporting updates to have the proper fields and tables available when everything is said and done. Now, I showed you earlier how to update a database. Obviously, those procedures are the same if you're updating your database for government reporting purposes. Another thing that's very common with our government reporting updates is we also give you a SQL script. Again, we're usually modifying fields or tables for some new purpose dictated by our friends at the friendly state and provincial education agencies. Be aware of that. We often send scripts to accompany government reporting updates. By the way, the order is probably spelled out in the update notes. Do I run the script first, or do I run the update first? Here's that ugly error message. This is actually an update notice sent in October by my good friend Dave Tolve. Dave says, run the update first, then run the SQL script. Alrighty then. Now, our e-government updater is just a little bit different from our other updaters. Now, what I just launched here is the 4.4.6 updater, which you should receive, I would say, within the next week. Because I've already installed 4.4.6 on this computer, the updater says, hey, do you want to repair your current install, or do you want to remove it? Well, believe me, remove does what it says. Well, repair does what it says too. And so if I wanted to do that, I would, select repair and I'd go ahead and say finish. Now, my actual install doesn't need repair, so I'm going to just go ahead and click cancel and get out of this for now. I just wanted you to see how the installer looks if you already have that version the updater is bringing. Plus, it's nice to know that repair is an option should you ever need it. Now, since I've already installed Government Reporting 4.4.6 on this machine, let me show you what a screen looks like if you're doing this in the real world. If you don't already have it installed, this is how the installer looks when it's actually a higher version than you've already got on your machine. Now, 99.999% of us should accept the top two choices as the defaults. The top one, default website. The bottom one is, it's asking you, what's the name of your virtual directory within your www root folder? And you know, you were in there with me, you saw me, it's SchoolLogic Government Reporting. If it's not really called that, you just type in the new name here. Now, the application pool down here, super important. Remember, we're in government reporting for something, 4.x. Therefore, just like SchoolLogic, 4.x, we want an application pool which uses .NET 4. It's pretty simple to remember, really. It's like 4s all around. Shouldn't be that hard. You know, you click Next, right, and you come to this guy. Of course, here, you hit Next again, and you move on to the actual install. Now, if you're installing for the first time, government reporting for the first time, you need to enter the information I'm about to show you. If you're updating, it's still a good idea to go and verify that the updater didn't somehow change this. Of course, it shouldn't change it, but recall what American President Ronald Reagan said once when he was negotiating with the Russians. Trust, but verify. Before I leave this PowerPoint screen, I want you to see how the installer leaves things the first time around. So if you're doing this the first time, you're going to see all the passwords are 1 to 9. You're going to see in here your machine name. Here's the value for reports. Now, in your world, it might very well be called SchoolLogic reports, but if it's called something else, you need to change that address. Report file share value. You need to install the name of your reporting server here. And then notice we have the same 2 lines that we showed you earlier today, where I've got this reports line with 2005 twice in the top one and 2010 twice in the bottom one. We're going to leave that the way it is. We're going to edit this up here. And then, oh, by the way, the installer just leaves you here. The data source is machine name. The database is database name. So these all need to be edited down here too. You can go to your web config file from SchoolLogic and you can just cut that information out. You can copy it. You can paste it in here. If that floats your boat, that's a beautiful way to do that. So that's kind of the story of government reporting updates. It's very, very similar to SchoolLogic. You got a few things that you got to be aware of. That it's a good idea to go in there, and you know where the web config file is, right? You go to www.root, go to SchoolLogic Government Reporting, and there's web config. And I showed you a second ago, when you do this from scratch, it comes in, it's just generic stuff here, and you want to go ahead and customize it to your install. You want this part of government reporting to pretty much look like this part of SchoolLogic. And you do that business where you find the word pages, and you just want to go to the second occurrence of the word pages, and you want to make sure that this debugger is set to false. That'll really help you out. Now, that's it for SchoolLogic government reporting. I got one thing I want to show you before I let you go, and that's TeacherLogic updates. Okay? If we back up here and we find our TeacherLogic updater, the very first window when TeacherLogic comes in here, I'm going to say next, and then I'm going to say, yeah, I accept the terms of license agreement, because SRB is like anybody else. If you say no, you're not going anywhere. Then I wanted to show you this, okay? Verify that this location looks correct, okay? And, I mean, we know that inside of www.root is MIG-Apps, and inside of MIG-Apps is TeacherLogic. Here he is right there, okay? So you just want to make sure that that's really where this is going. You can always click change if you need to make it go somewhere else. Very straightforward. You could have done this without me. The only reason I bring this up is, remember what I said earlier in the day? If you're ever in a position to install multiple pieces of our suite of products, and TeacherLogic is one of the pieces, always install it last, because it will install the DLL files which you need, which sometimes other parts of the suite have older ones, like HomeLogic does, okay? And if you don't get the DLL files right, then Logic Admin's not going to work, and you're not going to be able to control things the way you really would like to. Now, here's a little tip that you can use to figure out if the DLL files are correct. Now, I'll bring this down to the middle of the screen so you can see the URL better. This is the name of my web server, right? And then TeacherLogic EXE, that's just TeacherLogic. And, you know, if I took off install checker, if I just had this portion of it and I told the browser to go there, I'd be in TeacherLogic, right? So all you do is you take your TeacherLogic location, and on the back side of that, I've got a /, I've got install checker. Now, what's that give me? It gives me an install checker that we built into the routine, and you can see here, it's telling, first of all, almost everything is green. So if it's green, we're good to go. It's telling me that my DLL is properly registered. I've got a calculations DLL that TeacherLogic uses. He's properly registered. Look, we can open the logic config file. Look, SL Common is right. Remember what SL Common is? He's the traffic cop between SchoolLogic, TeacherLogic, and the actual data, and HomeLogic plays into that. Okay, SL Common is correct. And then it happens on my machine that TeacherLogic is SL Common is telling TeacherLogic, look, you can go either one of these places. Most schools, most of the time, TeacherLogic is pointed to one place. In my world, it happens to be pointed in two. And the computer's telling me here that this database called Various, his attachment path is correct. This other database called Gophers, his database, attachment path ain't happening. Okay, that's the only red thing I got on this screen. So it's good to go. How did I do that? I simply went / install checker after my TeacherLogic URL. Really, really simple to do. We can, always help you with that in support, but it's helpful to know. Well, everybody take a breath. I told you I'd get you out of here in 50 minutes. It looks like it took me about 57. Those are the highlights and even some of the little details, along with what I hope are some timely tips about installing our suite of Logic products. I wish you folks smooth trails ahead. I wish you a terrific Thursday afternoon. If you wish to review this webinar or share it with teammates, you see the address here, community.schoollogic.com. I'll probably have it up maybe Friday or Monday. So thank you so much for attending. Have a great Thursday afternoon. Thank you so much. Goodbye.